When a captured SS general stood in the courtyard of a liberated death camp and flatly refused to remove his Nazi medals in front of the survivors, he was making a very specific, deeply arrogant calculation. He was betting that the American military's obsession with protocol would protect his dignity. He was betting that the formal rules of war, the gentlemanly conduct expected between senior officers, would insulate him from the sheer, unimaginable horror of what his regime had just done to the people standing right behind him. He was betting that his uniform still meant something. He bet wrong. Because the man who walked into that courtyard a few moments later was not interested in protocol. He was not interested in gentlemanly conduct, and he was absolutely, completely done with the rules of war. It was General George S. Patton. Type the word pride in the comments right now if you can already feel the tension in that courtyard snapping like a dry branch, because what Patton did to that SS general in front of the men and women his regime had tried to exterminate is one of the most brutal, psychologically devastating, and intensely satisfying moments of cold-blooded justice in the entire history of the Second World War. To fully grasp the explosive gravity of this moment, you have to understand the specific psychological armor that the SS wore at the end of the war. According to the meticulously detailed accounts in Martin Blumenson's The Patton Papers and the archival records of the Third Army's liberation of the camps in the spring of 1945, the high-ranking officers of the Schutzstaffel, the SS, did not view themselves as defeated soldiers. Even as their cities burned and their armies collapsed, they clung to the delusion of their own racial and military supremacy. Their uniforms were not just fabric, they were the physical manifestation of an ideology. The silver death's head on their caps, the double lightning bolt runes on their collars, the iron crosses pinned to their chests, these were not just military decorations. They were symbols of absolute, unaccountable power. For 12 years, those medals meant that the man wearing them could walk into a town, point a finger, and end 1,000 lives without a second thought. And in the spring of 1945, as the American Third Army tore through the German heartland and tore the doors off the concentration camps, Patton ordered that captured German officials and officers be brought face to face with the atrocities they had committed or enabled. He forced mayors, civilians, and captured military commanders to walk through the camps, to smell the air, to look at the bodies, and to look into the eyes of the living skeletons who had survived. The SS general in this story had been brought to one of these camps for exactly this purpose. According to the accounts of American soldiers present during these post-liberation processing operations, the scene in the courtyard was a study in grotesque contrasts. On one side, the survivors. Men and women wrapped in rags, their bodies reduced to bone and hollow eyes, standing in the freezing mud, barely able to support their own weight. On the other side, the captured SS general, well-fed, impeccably groomed, wearing a tailored, pristine gray uniform covered in the gleaming metal of Nazi honors. An American processing officer, operating under the standard denazification procedures that were rapidly being implemented, ordered the general to strip his uniform of its Nazi insignia and medals. It was a standard directive, a symbolic stripping of authority before processing. The German general refused. He didn't just say no. He stood up straighter. He adjusted his posture into a stance of pure, unadulterated contempt. He informed the American officer, in crisp, fluent English, that these medals were honors bestowed upon him by his state for valor and service. He stated that under the Geneva Conventions, a captured officer of his rank was entitled to retain his uniform and his decorations. And he made it devastatingly clear, simply by the way he looked at the survivors standing a few yards away, that he would not suffer the humiliation of stripping his honors in front of them. In his mind, they were still subhuman, and he was still the master race. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating, pressurized silence of an injustice so massive it threatens to crack the sky. The American soldiers gripped their rifles, their knuckles turning white. The survivors watched, their hollow eyes reflecting a terrifying realization. Even in defeat, the monsters still hold the power. The nightmare isn't over. And then the sound of heavy cavalry boots crunched against the gravel. Type the word gravel in the comments if you know exactly who just arrived, because when General George S. Patton walked into that courtyard, the entire atmospheric pressure of the world shifted. Patton was on an inspection tour of the camp. He had already walked through the sheds. He had already seen the ovens. He had already walked past the piles of human beings stacked like cordwood. Men who served with Patton during those weeks noted that the camps changed him fundamentally. The aggressive, bombastic cavalryman was replaced by something much darker. A man vibrating with a cold, terrifying, almost biblical wrath. Patton walked into the center of the courtyard. He looked at the American processing officer. He looked at the survivors, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second, acknowledging the unimaginable weight of what they had endured. And then he locked eyes with the SS general. According to the memoirs of the men who stood in that courtyard, Patton did not yell. He didn't scream. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he was standing just inches from the German officer's face. He looked at the gleaming iron cross. He looked at the SS runes. He looked at the perfectly polished boots that were standing on ground soaked in the blood of innocent people. Patton asked the American officer what the delay was. The officer explained that the prisoner was citing the Geneva Conventions and refusing to remove his military honors. Patton slowly turned his head back to the SS general. He spoke in a voice that was quiet, raspy, and sharper than shattered glass. He told the German general that the Geneva Conventions were written for soldiers. They were written for men who fought other men on battlefields, who respected the laws of armed conflict, and who possessed something resembling human honor. He then raised a single, leather-gloved finger and pointed directly at the chest of the SS general. He told him that the medals pinned to his chest were not military honors. They were the accounting records of a butcher. He told him that he was not a soldier, he was not a commander, and he was absolutely not protected by the gentlemanly rules of a war he had turned into an industrial slaughterhouse. Patton informed him with the total, absolute authority of a man who commanded hundreds of thousands of heavily armed American troops that the uniform he was wearing was not a mark of rank. It was a confession. The German general's jaw clenched. The arrogance was still there, flickering in his eyes, but it was suddenly fighting for its life against the sheer physical intimidation of Patton's presence. He opened his mouth to argue, to cite his rank, to demand to speak to a superior officer. Patton didn't let him get a single syllable out. Type the word shatter in the comments right now if you are ready for the arrogance of this Nazi officer to be completely destroyed, because what Patton did next wasn't just about enforcing an order. It was about psychological annihilation. Patton stepped closer, invading the general's space so completely that the German had to physically tilt his head back. Patton told him that he had two choices. Choice one, he could take his own hands, right now, in front of the people he had tried to murder, and he could tear every single piece of Nazi metal off his chest and drop it into the mud. He could strip himself of his own pride. He could acknowledge that his regime was dead, and he could do it while the survivors watched him be reduced to exactly what he was, a defeated criminal in a dirty uniform. Choice two, Patton would have two American military policemen hold him down, and Patton would personally cut the medals off his chest using a bayonet, and he wouldn't be particularly careful about where the blade went. And after that, Patton would leave him in the courtyard, alone with the survivors, and whatever happened next would be written off as a tragic administrative oversight. It was not a bluff. Anyone who knew George S. Patton, anyone who looked into his eyes in the spring of 1945, after he had seen the camps, knew that it was absolutely, terrifyingly real. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of SS arrogance. It was the silence of a predator, realizing it was suddenly, hopelessly, the prey. The SS general looked at Patton. He looked at the American soldiers, whose hands were white-knuckling their M1 Garands, practically begging for the general to choose option 2. And finally, he looked at the survivors. For the first time in 12 years, he didn't look at them as subhuman. He looked at them as the witnesses to his complete and total humiliation. Slowly, his hands came up to his chest. His fingers were shaking. He unclasped the Iron Cross, the symbol of German military pride, and let it fall. It hit the mud with a dull, pathetic thud. He reached up to his collar. He ripped off the SS runes. He tore the death's head from his cap. Piece by piece, honor by honor, he stripped himself of the ideology that had burned Europe to the ground. He didn't just hand them to an American officer. Patton made him drop them in the dirt, right at his own feet. When it was done, the German general stood there. The tailored uniform now looked cheap, ruined, with torn threads where the metal used to be. He wasn't a master race anymore. He was just an old, tired, defeated man standing in the mud. Patton didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He looked at the medals in the dirt. Then he looked at the survivors. According to the men who were there, Patton gave the survivors a single, slow nod. A silent communication between the American commander and the people he had liberated. It was a nod that said, "The monsters can bleed. The monsters can break. And they will never hurt you again." He turned his back on the German officer, entirely dismissing his existence, and ordered the military police to process the prisoner like any other common criminal. Type the word justice in the comments if you believe that making that SS officer strip his own medals in front of his victims was the exact right thing to do. This story is not just a footnote in military history. It is the absolute core of why we study history in the first place. Because history isn't just about dates and maps and troop movements. It's about moments of profound moral clarity. It's about the exact second when the abstract concept of victory becomes a tangible physical reality for the people who suffered the most. The Nuremberg trials would eventually bring the legal hammer down on the architects of the Nazi regime. But the law is slow. The law is clinical. The law happens in clean courtrooms with lawyers in suits. What happened in that courtyard wasn't the law. It was justice. Raw, immediate, undeniable justice. The survivors in that camp didn't need a legal brief to know the war was over. They needed to see the physical breaking of the men who had tortured them. They needed to see the Iron Cross in the mud. Patton understood that. He understood that you cannot just defeat an evil ideology on a map. You have to break its spirit in the real world, in front of the people it tried to destroy. If this story made you feel the true, heavy weight of what those American soldiers accomplished in 1945, do one thing before you scroll away. Hit the like button. Not for the algorithm. Hit it for the survivors in that courtyard who finally got to see their tormentor broken. Subscribe to this channel if you want the raw, unfiltered, deeply human history that the sanitized textbooks are too polite to tell you. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. And leave your honest thoughts in the comments, because this community's conversation is the most important part of these videos, and I read every single one. I will see you in the next one.